The story I want to share is from the Bible. I figure that's a fitting place to start. In 2 Samuel, starting in chapter 12, it says this: The Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, There were two men in a certain town, one rich, the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food and drank from his cup and even slept in his arms. The lamb was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took to the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, Surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity. Then Nathan said to David, You are this man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judea, and if that had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites, and now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. This is what the Lord says. Out of your own household I am going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you. He will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. What you did you did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan replied, The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. But because by doing this you've shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die. After Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and the child became ill. David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted and spent nights lying in sackcloth on the ground. The elders of his household stood beside him to get up from the ground, but he refused. He would not eat any food with them. On the 7th day, the child died. David's attendants were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they thought while the child was still living, he wouldn't listen to us when we spoke to him. How can we now tell him that the child is dead? He may do something desperate. So I grew up in the church. I've heard all the stories I felt like growing up, and I heard all about David, how he was a man after God's own heart, that he slayed Goliath, that he took over after corrupt King Saul, and that he gave his son Solomon as the wisest man who ever lived. Like, that's who this guy is. And most of us were raised also hearing about his greatest failure, the story of him and Uriah's wife. And not just him sleeping with Uriah's wife, but having Uriah murdered after he couldn't frame the pregnancy on Uriah. And with that, it's hard to process that David is called a man after God's own heart. and yet he did all of this. Some people use that as an excuse to say that God picks and chooses his favorites. Some people just say that God's corrupt. And they'll use this other story that we discussed here, that God killed David's son for the sin that David caused. And yeah, that's a tough one to swallow. I actually had never heard the rest of the story. I had heard that David had slept with Uriah's wife. I had heard that David had Uriah killed, and I had read these stories. I had heard that the prophet Nathan came to David and confronted him and told him that the sword would never leave his family, that David would suffer for the rest of his reign because of this decision. But as a kid, I was never told this next part. The part of David's son being sentenced to death by God because of David's sin. And honestly, that's not fair. Like, I see this and I think about it, and I always struggled because I know I'm messed up. I have messed up a lot. I messed up so bad I went to prison for it. And actually, in prison is when I first read that story. And I felt completely condemned because I felt like David. I felt that pain, that my sin had caused others to suffer, not just myself. It was okay that I suffered in my mind. I had messed up. I could come to terms with that. But my family suffered. My friends suffered. People who loved me and cared about me suffered horribly because of what I had done. And that's how it made sense to me. Sin doesn't just affect us. Sin in our own lives affects everyone around us. It's not an isolated incident where it only happens within your own heart. It happens to the world around us. And I think the story tells that beautifully. It's a reminder that those hidden sins are not the only things that matter. So I read this story, and I thought to myself, how in the world is David called a man after God's own heart after this? And I think this next portion really tells us what that really means, to be a man after God's own heart, or a human after God's own heart. God had made his decree that the child would die, and the child became ill. It didn't die immediately. The child suffered for 7 days. So on the 7th day, the child died. David's attendants were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they thought while the child was still living, he wouldn't listen to us when we spoke to him. How can we now tell him that the child is dead? He may do something desperate. In other words, he might take his own life. Like, that's how serious this is. That's what I believe that means. So David notices that his attendants were whispering among themselves, and he realized the child was dead. Is the child dead? He asked. Yes, they replied. He is dead. When I started seeing that my family suffered for what I did, and my friends, I got angry. Mostly at myself, not at God. But if God had taken my child's life for what I had done, I would be so mad at God. I would be so angry. I would act like a child. I'd throw a fit. I would probably break quite a few things. And I would for a little bit, probably turned my back on God. But David gets up from the ground, washes himself, put on lotions, and changed his clothes. He'd been lying in the dirt for 7 days. Okay, that's fair enough. Get cleaned. Okay. Hasn't eaten in 7 days. And he goes to the house of the Lord not to yell at God, but to worship him. He goes and rejoices to the God that just took away his child. I don't think I could do that. I don't think I could worship God after killing one of my children. I don't even have any children yet, but I know that I would love them, and I couldn't even imagine having that strength to go worship God after that. Then David went to his own home, and at his request they served him food, and he ate. He didn't eat until after he worshiped God. Even if I was going to go worship God after he had taken my child's life, I would have taken care of myself first. Or even not showered and got some food and then kind of half-hearted worshiped God. David cleaned himself up to present himself to God and then took care of his own human needs. It's mind-boggling to me that he did that. And his own attendants asked him the same questions. Why are you acting this way? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept, and now that your child is dead, you get up and eat. Now, to be fair, they have a very good reason to ask him this. Back in that time, he should have been eating while the child was sick. He should have been taking care of himself. And once the child is dead, that is when you fast. That is when you mourn. That is when you take time away to cry over your loss and show it through your sacrifice. That was their tradition. And David answered, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that the child is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. In other words, eventually I will die and be with the child, but the child will never come back to this earth. God has made his decision. And then it wraps up the story in a very, very weird way, in my opinion, and I love it. Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba, and he went to her and made love to her. And she gave birth to a son, and they named him Solomon. Now just remember, Bathsheba is the one who just had this child that died. The child born out of sin, adultery, murder. And their very next child is Solomon. Someone who saw God's favor enough where God made him the wisest man to ever live. The next king of Israel. Well, the next long-term king of Israel. There was a small insurrection at some point, but we'll ignore that. It's interesting that God used the relationship born out of sin, David and Bathsheba, to create Solomon. And in fact, in the book of Matthew, it starts with what a lot of people find the most boring parts of the Bible, at least the lists of genealogy. So Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac was the father of Jacob, Jacob was the father of Judah, blah, 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 blah. But there's an important part in verse 6 and 7, Matthew chapter 1. And Jesse was the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife, and Solomon was the father of Rehoboam. Solomon was included in the genealogy of Jesus. So I don't know where you are in your life right now. I don't know what you've been through. I don't know where you're going. I don't know if you're in the depths of your darkest moment. I don't know if you've just crawled out. I don't know if that is still to come. But I do know this. Your darkest moment doesn't have to be your last. That's why I shared that I went to prison at the beginning of this, and that I've struggled myself with these very same things. Because that's not the end of the story. There's much more to learn, there's much more to do. And the worst thing you can do is to give up. The worst thing you can do is to let everything fall away because you don't think you're good enough. I put my hope, like David, in a God who I trust will do the right thing, even if it's difficult. It may not look the way I want it to. It may cause pain and suffering. But I do have hope that it isn't the end. Thank you, and good night.